Mr. Danhoff, welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate being here this evening, and just to share with you a few thoughts about what's been known as and talked about as the City Center 2 bond issue. As you are well aware, state law requires that when cities issue or propose to issue bonds, which are either primarily or secondarily secured by the city's full faith and credit, that they publish a notice of intent and referendum rights are given to the citizens with respect to that type of a bond issue. You adopted such a resolution, and such a notice was published with respect to bonds for the infrastructure improvements for what is known as the City Center 2 project. And these are, I might note, public infrastructure improvements that are related to this project. The bonds that are proposed to be issued by the city for this project are structured and intend to be structured as self-supporting debt. That is to say that the city intends not only to structure these to be paid out of tax increments and parking revenues, but to make sure that those revenues and those estimates are adequate to pay principal and interest payment on the bonds. Our involvement so far in looking at structuring of this would confirm that that would be a feasible structure in this scenario, where the tax increments together with available parking revenues would be sufficient to pay principal and interest on the bonds. I might note that the notice of intent, which was published and adopted by the council, states that. That is, simply states that the city intends to pay the principal of and interest on these bonds from parking revenues and from tax increment revenues from the Downtown Development Authority and the Brownfield Redevelopment Authority. Only in the event of insufficiency should the city's general fund be called upon. Now, this isn't anything new at East Lansing. All of your bonds that you have outstanding have full faith and credit pledges on them. At my looking at this right now, you have outstanding some 18 bond issues which have full faith and credit pledges for about $55 million. So nothing new. Your bonds that you currently have outstanding pledging your full faith and credit are primarily payable from and are shown as payable from special assessments, parking revenues, sewer revenues, and DDA revenues. And in your official statements, relative to all your debt, you're showing all of this $55 million in debt is self-supporting. That is, it's all being paid from those particular revenue sources. But again, in each case, the city's full faith and credit has been pledged as a backup, a secondary guarantee in the event of insufficiency of these revenues. I might note that the city has a very high credit rating. It is currently AA+. You wouldn't have that high a credit rating if these bonds, which indeed you intended to be self-supporting, were not self-supporting. So every time you go to the market, you're tested as to whether or not these assumptions are correct and whether or not the bonds that you structured as self-supporting indeed continue to be so. So why do we have the city's full faith or credit pledge anyway? Simple. You need to sell the bonds. The marketplace demands that we have full faith or credit pledges of cities to support bonds, particularly bonds which are supported by tax increment revenues, bonds which are supported by special assessments, and bonds which are supported by parking system revenues. If you look at your city, if you look at the surrounding cities, you'll find that all of these bonds are structured in a similar way. And through one mechanism or another, there is, as previously noted, a city guarantee relative to all of this debt. So when the city looks at this, and I think it's a point that's been lost, and that is these bonds are never intended to be paid out of the general fund of the city. They're being structured and we sold and represented to the public and through your official statements as self-supporting debt, just like the 18 bond issues you've done in the past, which are outstanding for the $55 million worth of self-supporting debt, which is supported by the city's full faith and credit. I guess I just finally like to note that I found not only the city and your staff to be incredibly careful as to the use of city bonding, and particularly the use of the full faith and credit of the city when doing bonds over the last 20-some years that I've been involved with the city. And you should be very proud of that. This is not something that is done lightly and is not done without a lot of thought and a lot of planning, most of which, you know, I see only part of, and you probably see even less. But believe me, it's there. The numbers are run, and they're run, and they're run, and they're run, so everybody is satisfied that, that this type of debt is going to be self-supporting debt and will not be in any way a drain on the city's general fund. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sure. Any questions of Mr. Danhoff? Bill, just one clarification. The nomenclature of the bonds seems to be creating the confusion here. From a functional standpoint, and even from a technical standpoint, is the nomenclature not more descriptive of the transaction than it is the underlying creditworthiness of the bonds? I mean, because you do a TIF bond or a revenue bond or a general obligation bond, by its nomenclature, that doesn't suggest that one is more secure to an investor or less secure, does it?
No, it does not. And again, the homogenizing factor of those credit in each of those instances is a city pledge of full faith and credit, so that the investor is looking at, can be assured, really I'd say of two things. One is by a city putting its full faith and credit on there, that they're indeed have taken a real hard look at it. They're not, they understand that, you know, the bondholder understands that you as a city have taken a hard look at this, and that in order to sustain yourselves, you have to make sure that these bonds will be paid from the sources that you intend to pay them from. And again, in this case, we're looking at tax and increment revenues and parking revenues. I hope that answers the question.
Okay. Just one final question from my standpoint. What will the nomenclature on these bonds be? Do you know?
It will depend. We're looking, these would probably be City of East Lansing, general obligation bonds, or Downtown Development Authority bonds with city full faith and credit pledged in the title. But again, the structure of the issue from a structuring perspective will be as structured as if we were doing a revenue bond. And will be self-supporting. But that's just the way the state law is set up. That's just the name that you call the bonds, and that's fairly commonplace.
I just changed my mind. I have one last question for you. Okay. Is there anything in what you have seen and what we are proposing to do that is in any way different or peculiar or uncharacteristic of any other local governmental entity issuing bonds for this type of purpose from your perspective?
No, this is the way that every city I've ever dealt with would deal with an issue like this, and be looking at doing exactly what you're doing, assisting in the public part of the project and using all the resources that the state government has made available to you, including tax increments, to secure that repayment. This is the way cities do business, and this is the way public infrastructure is built these days.